Hello everyone. Today we will be doing part 5 of my election series. I tried filming part 5, but what happened was that it wouldn't process the video. So I'm filming it again. I got all...
Where's the video? Film it on the big screen.
It's fine.
No, it's really fine. Don't never sleep alone. I don't want to sleep now.
Anyway. Yeah, today we're just going to be running through my election series again. Last time I tried filming this, I got all the way to the election of 1912. And it wasn't processing the video, so I was so upset, don't get me wrong. But yeah, today we're just going to be running through hopefully all that again, and maybe some more. What?
Look at my vaccine, but I also want to be woken up. Dad, I'm going to wake me up.
Alright, let me let this video play, and I'll be right with you, alright? So, let's get started.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 27th presidential election in American history took place on November 8, 1892. Benjamin Harrison had a rough term as president, and even though he had doubts himself, he decided to run for re-election. The Republican Party went ahead and renominated him, despite potential challenges from John Sherman and James Blaine again. Levi Morton would not be renominated, however. Back in 1890, Harrison supported the Lodge Bill, an election law meant to help the black vote in the South as a way to fight Jim Crow laws, but it didn't pass. Harrison blamed Morton for the bill's failure, and at the Republican convention, Morton was replaced by Whitelaw Reid, the editor of the New York Tribune and recent U.S. ambassador to France. Guess who's back? Grover's back. After winning the popular vote but losing the electoral vote in 1888, Grover Cleveland was back with a vengeance in 1892. While many were ready for a return to his policies, he did face opponents like David Hill, the senator and former governor of New York. However, Cleveland survived to become the first Democrat nominated a third time to run for president. The Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson, a former U.S. representative from Illinois, for vice president. Stevenson was an interesting choice because he favored greenbacks and free silver to inflate the currency, while Cleveland was a gold standard guy who didn't like just printing money. Cleveland was cool with Stevenson being on the ticket, though, as it provided some balance. Still, a lot of Americans were not satisfied with the two-party system, and by this time, a new movement had emerged. The previous year, alliances made up of poor cotton farmers in the South and wheat farmers in the Plains states, along with some labor unions in the North and Republicans in the South, all joined forces to create a new political party called the People's Party. More commonly known as populists, they generally were hostile to elites, banks, railroad corporations, the gold standard, and even city folk. If you wanted to know more about the populists, check out my storytime video now. I'll wait for you to come back. I promise. But only if you first pause this video. Otherwise, I will just keep talking. You good now? Okay, so the Populists had their first convention in Omaha, Nebraska, which was a populist hotspot. They nominated James Weaver, the former U.S. representative from Iowa who had previously ran for president in the Greenback Party back in 1880 but lost. His running mate was James Field, the Attorney General of Virginia. The Prohibition Party was still going strong. At their convention, there were talks of merging with the Populists, but it just never panned out. They nominated John Bidwell, one of the original pioneers to head out west, and a former U.S. representative from California. Texas religious leader James Cranfill, aka the Reverend J.B. Cranfill, was Bidwell's running mate. One interesting political party that emerged in 1892 was...
Okay, sorry I didn't stop when I got to third parties like I'm supposed to. But I cast my vote for Grover Cleveland because, again, I don't like Harrison's now imperialist and, again, high tariff leanings. So yeah, I'm gonna vote for Cleveland. Let the results play, and then go on to the election of 1896.
Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. So they all now got to participate. And here are the results. Grover Cleveland won, becoming the 24th president in American history. He received 277 electoral votes. He won 46% of the popular vote, which was actually his worst showing yet, but a win is a win. Benjamin Harrison received 145 electoral votes and 43% of the popular vote. Populist James Weaver finished third with 22 electoral votes and 8.5% of the popular vote. He became the only third-party candidate between 1860 and 1912 to win electoral votes. He did especially well in the West and South. John Bidwell received 2.2% of the popular vote, the best performance by the Prohibition Party yet. All other candidates received less than 1%. Adlai Stevenson became the 23rd vice president in American history. This was the first time incumbent presidents were defeated in 2 consecutive elections. This wouldn't happen again until 1980. Up to that point in history,
Billionaires Bill Gates, Jack Ma, Richard Branson, Michael Bloomberg, and Jeff Bezos are all in
Mr. Beat American history. Presidential elections in American history. The 28th presidential election in American history took place on November 3rd, 1896. Turnout was high, and people were saying things like, "This is the most important election ever." Yeah, right, as if they don't say that every election. Grover Cleveland's second term didn't go so well. For most of it, the country had been stuck in a severe economic depression. And while the populist movement was at its peak, with poor people pointing fingers at, quote, the man, everybody seemed to be losing money during this time, even the rich. The Republicans rallied behind a new face on the national scene, William McKinley, the former governor of Ohio. They nominated Garrett Hobart as his running mate, a former New Jersey legislator. The Democratic Party had generally shifted away from Cleveland to a more, quote, free silver monetary policy, calling for inflation to help ease the economic crisis. In fact, they had adopted several of the populist ideas. At first, there was no obvious successor to Cleveland, and several candidates emerged, like old Silver Dick himself, Richard P. Bland, the former U.S. representative from Missouri. However, soon, another dude stood out quite a bit, mostly for his incredibly awesome speeches. 36-year-old William Jennings Bryan, a former U.S. representative and lawyer from Nebraska, gave his famous Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention. In the speech, he sounded very much like a populist, passionately attacking big city corporations and the gold standard, while calling for government relief for farmers and others hurt by the Depression. His speech was so dramatic that after he was done, some delegates carried him on their shoulders out of the room as if he was the quarterback who had just scored the winning touchdown. Needless to say, Bryan got the nomination. The Democrats nominated Arthur Sewell, a shipbuilder from Maine, to be his running mate. The Populist Party also endorsed William Jennings Bryan, since his party basically co-opted their ideas, and so did the newly formed Silver Party. So it was quite a fusionist election. Meanwhile, Democrats who were not on board with the free...
Okay, before it goes on, I'm going to cast my vote now, and I'm going to cast my vote for William Jennings Bryan, because William McKinley's high tariff leanings, similar to Benjamin Harrison's, are not ones I like, and I think that high tariffs are just going to make the economy worse, and I don't like his imperialist leanings, so no, I'm not going to vote for him.
And here are the results. William
Yeah,
McKinley
just what the
won,
results were.
becoming the 25th president in American history. He received 271 electoral votes and 51% of the popular vote. He did particularly well in the East and Northeast. William Jennings Bryan received 176 electoral votes and 46.7% of the popular vote. He particularly did well with farmers in the South, West, and Midwest. John Palmer finished third with just under 1% of the popular vote. Joshua Levering finished fourth, just over 3,000 votes behind Palmer. Garrett Hobart became the 24th vice president in American history. While Bryan's defeat was a blow to populist momentum, many of the
I'm a little angry at this point because, again, I don't like William McKinley as a person. I don't like his political beliefs.
ideas brought into the mainstream during his campaign would stick around long after this election.
By 2050, there will be more
10
plastic.
minutes in this
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. Finally, we've made it to the 20th century. The 29th presidential election in American history took place on November 6th, 1900, exactly 81 years before my birthday. Oh boy, we've got ourselves another rematch. During William McKinley's first term, the United States, by many accounts, became much stronger. The economy was back to being awesome, and the country had joined the Imperial Club. That's right, America was now officially an imperialist country, thanks to becoming involved in the Spanish-American War. The United States easily defeated Spain, gaining its colonies Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and even Cuba for a little while. Sure, there were some shady sides to this war and its aftermath, like the Philippine-American War, which raged on, but Americans were feeling pretty darn good about themselves overall. The war represented American entry into world affairs, actually acting out what the Monroe Doctrine promised 75 years prior. Since then, the United States has had a pretty consistent role in policing various conflicts all over the world. Anyway, so McKinley was popular and easily renominated. However, his vice president, Garrett Hobart, had passed away, and McKinley needed a replacement to run with him this time. One name floating around was New York Governor Theodore Roosevelt. He was the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley and a somewhat reckless war hero of the Spanish-American War. Thomas C. Platt, the New York State Republican Party boss, hated Roosevelt and wanted him out of the state. So he pressured McKinley to agree to let him be his running mate. Although Roosevelt wasn't too excited about the possibility of becoming vice president, he accepted the nomination anyway. Early on, the Democrats were leaning toward nominating another Spanish-American war hero, George Dewey, who was the admiral of the Navy and from Vermont. Dewey made a fool out of himself, however, so that ultimately opened the door again to William Jennings Bryan, who still had a large force of passionate supporters. Adlai Stevenson was his running mate. Stevenson was the first former vice president to win renomination for that position with a different presidential candidate. So it was another battle of the Williams, but let's not forget third presidential candidate. So
with both candidates in front of me, again, I don't like McKinley's tariffs, and again, I don't like the fact that the country is now imperialist. But I'm voting for William Jennings Bryan again because I like his overall progressive views. And I like Teddy Roosevelt. And let's be honest, I would vote for McKinley if I knew he died. But, you know what? Since I don't know he died, I'm voting for Bryan. Alright, so I'm going to go to the results, let them play, and then go on to the election of 1904.
So it was another battle of the Williams. But let's not forget third-party candidates. By this time, the Populist Party, or People's Party, had splintered. The faction known as the Fusion Populists again supported William Jennings Bryan for the nomination. But the middle-of-the-road Populists nominated Wharton Barker, a publicist and investor from Pennsylvania, with Ignatius Donnelly, a former U.S. and middle-of-the-road Populists nominated Wharton as after a populist serial. So this election, while playing the just like all, he would end up being an important force to reckon on re-election. And here are the results. William McKinley won re-election, receiving 292 electoral votes. William Jennings Bryan finished as runner-up again, this time receiving 155 electoral votes. McKinley won 51.6% of the popular vote, better than in his first election, while Bryan had a worse showing this time, finishing with 45.5% of the popular vote. John Woolley finished third with 1.5% of the popular vote. All other candidates finished with less than 1% of the popular vote. Theodore Roosevelt became the 25th vice president in American history. And while he wasn't the most excited for the position, I have a feeling he will be getting a promotion soon.
We are being deceived. The border crisis is not like what we've been told. Behind the 5 million illegal immigrants who entered
Mr. Beat presents the 30th presidential election in American history took place on November 8, 1904. Theodore Roosevelt was running for re-election. Hold up, Teddy Roosevelt? What happened to McKinley? Let's rewind 3 years. Back on September 6, 1901, an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz shot President William McKinley twice as he was shaking hands at the Temple of Music in Buffalo, New York. The wounds became infected, and McKinley died 8 days later. It was after this that the Secret Service provided full-time presidential protection, by the way. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in and became the 26th president in American history. At age 42, he was the youngest man to ever become president, but he wasn't intimidated. He went straight to work, promising the average Joe fairness, fighting the giant corporations that have monopolies on the market, championing the construction of the Panama Canal. Oh yeah, click here to see my video about the Panama Canal. And regulating the railroads, food, and drugs. He made conservation a top priority, establishing a bunch of national parks, forests, and monuments. He even helped end the Russo-Japanese War, becoming the first president to earn a Nobel Peace Prize for doing so. More than any president before him, he welcomed the press with open arms. After noticing reporters just outside the White House getting wet in the rain one day, he let them in and gave them their own room. By doing so, he basically invented. He was extremely popular. Some fellow Republicans, however, called him a radical due to his progressive policies, and they tried to get Mark Hanna to run against him as the official nominee. However, Hanna died in February, and no serious contender could replace Hanna to rise to compete with Roosevelt. So Roosevelt was the nominee. But to make the conservatives happy, the Republicans nominated Charles Fairbanks, the likable senator from Indiana, as his running mate. The Democrats had a hard time finding a strong nominee that could compete with Roosevelt. William Jennings Bryan didn't want to run a third time, and they even asked Grover Cleveland to run again, but he turned it down too. A lot of Bryan's supporters flocked to the New York newspaper publisher turned U.S. representative William Randolph Hearst, but Hearst frankly scared many Democrats to death. So many of them turned to Alton Parker, the chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals. They nominated Henry Davis, a former senator from West Virginia, as his running mate. At 80 years old, Davis was the oldest major party candidate ever to be
You know what? They share a lot of political views, but Alton Parker was just more boring. I'm honestly voting for Roosevelt, so I'm gonna let the results play. And then I am gonna head to the election of 1908. I am almost back where I was last time I filmed this video.
How do you think?
And I'm glad I'm gotten here.
Let's
hope I can get even further than this.
I
Yeah.
decided to destroy the most
Results. Theodore Roosevelt easily won re-election. In fact, it was a landslide. Roosevelt received 336 electoral votes, and Alton Parker only received 140 electoral votes. Roosevelt absolutely dominated everywhere except the South. Roosevelt became the first Republican to win the state of Missouri since 1868. The popular vote was just as lopsided, with Roosevelt getting 56.4% and Parker getting just 37.6%. Eugene Debs came in third, not winning electoral votes, but getting a respectable 3% of the popular vote. Silas Swallow came in fourth, getting 1.9% of the popular vote. Charles Fairbanks became the 26th vice president in American history. Teddy Roosevelt became the first president to win an election after becoming president not by election in American history.
Eve to me is basically freedom. It's a giant open universe where you.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 31st presidential election in American history took place on November 3, 1908. Throughout his presidency, Theodore Roosevelt had managed to gain fans from both the Republican and Democratic parties. His ideas were what we now call progressive. But by 1908, everybody seemed to want to be called progressive. It was pretty trendy. While Roosevelt didn't get as much accomplished in his second term, he remained very popular. After the last election, he promised he would not run for a third term, and instead fully endorsed his close friend and the Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, to continue the progressive reforms that he had started. Even though Taft had much rather be on the Supreme Court than be president, he couldn't turn Roosevelt down. The Republican nomination process marked the first time a presidential preference primary happened, where delegates were chosen from multiple states. At the convention, most Republicans would do whatever Roosevelt recommended, and Taft was officially nominated. Although Roosevelt seemed to get more cheers than he did, a lot of them really wanted Roosevelt to run again after all. They nominated James Sherman, a U.S. representative from New York, as Taft's running mate. Perhaps the main reason why William Jennings Bryan did not run for president in 1904 is because he agreed with Roosevelt on many issues. In fact, perhaps Roosevelt stole some of his ideas. Now that Roosevelt was out of the picture, Bryan actually argued he was the more logical successor to Roosevelt than Taft. Despite the fact that Bryan had lost the previous two times he ran, he remained very popular, and the Democratic Party went with him again. Third time's a charm, right? The Democrats nominated John Kern, a former member of the Indiana Senate, as Bryan's running mate. While there were at least 5 third parties who tried.
I'm going to stop here and I'm going to cast my vote. I do agree that William Jennings Bryan would be a more logical successor to Theodore Roosevelt. And I will vote with it. I will vote for William Jennings Bryan again. So I'm just going to let the results play. And then, yeah. We'll move on to the next election, where I was.
Results. William Howard Taft won, becoming the 27th president in American history. Taft won pretty handily. He received 321 electoral votes and 51.6% of the popular vote. William Jennings Bryan finished second place yet again. It was his worst defeat yet, and he wouldn't run for president again after this. He received 162 electoral votes and 43% of the popular vote. Looking at this map, you can see that Taft did well mostly in the north and out west, but Bryan did well in the south again, and better in new random regions all over the country. Bryan's support was more diverse than ever, yet still too short. Eugene Debs came in third again with 2.8% of the popular vote. Eugene Chafin
I can turn anything into pillow. Those words? Bam! Now pillow. Dog, cat, steak.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 32nd presidential election in American history took place on November 5th, 1912. Oh yeah, this was the election that was completely and utterly messed up. It was weird, man. Really weird. How weird? Well, look at that electoral map, for crying out loud. What the heck is that? But I'm ahead of myself. Let's go back a bit. The Taft presidency was supposed to be Theodore Roosevelt 2.0, but right off the bat, it just wasn't that way. Taft was like his own person. He fired cabinet members that Roosevelt had approved of or appointed. While Taft continued to fight trusts, he placed less of a commitment to conservation, labor unions, and restrictions on the employment of women and children. Soon there was a clear split in the Republican Party between the more conservative-leaning Republicans led by Taft and the progressive Republicans led by Teddy Roosevelt. After traveling around the world with his family for more than a year, Roosevelt came home to one of the biggest receptions ever given in New York. That changed when eventually a bunch of progressive Republicans expanded their primaries to include even more delegates from across the country to the National Convention to choose their nominee. Going into the convention, Roosevelt actually had more delegates than Taft did. Taft's people, however, controlled the convention and essentially shut out many of the Roosevelt delegates. This, of course, made Roosevelt very angry, and he and his supporters stormed out of the convention. Not since the election of 1872 had there been such a major divide within the Republican Party. In fact, Roosevelt and his supporters completely abandoned the Republicans, 2 weeks later meeting up to create their own political party called the Progressive Party. These progressives nominated Roosevelt for president, well, duh, and Hiram Johnson, the governor of California, as his running mate. At the convention, Roosevelt passionately promoted what he called a new nationalism. Their platform sought a minimum wage for women, an 8-hour workday, a child labor law, a social security system, a national health service, and the direct election of U.S. senators, among other things. Afterward, Roosevelt told reporters he felt as strong as a bull moose. After that, the Progressive Party became popularly known as the Bull Moose Party. Despite the excitement of the Bull Moose Party, the Republicans pressed on with Taft as their candidate and James Sherman again as his running mate. Believe it or not, with Taft as their candidate and James Sherman again as his running mate. Believe it or not, Sherman was the first incumbent vice president to be nominated for re-election since John Calhoun way back in 1828. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party, who hadn't done so well in presidential elections since, before the Civil War, saw this major split of the Republican Party as a golden opportunity. They had a bit of drama as well at their own convention. Originally, it looked like Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House from Missouri, was going to be the guy, but he failed to get the 2/3 majority needed to secure the nomination. In second place was Woodrow Wilson, the governor of New Jersey. Wilson didn't really think he had a chance, but then William Jennings Bryan decided to endorse him, and Bryan still had a lot of fans, so he had a lot of influence. On the 46th ballot, that's right, I said 46th, Wilson was nominated, with Thomas Marshall, the governor of Indiana, as his running mate. So that's it? Oh,
This is a tough choice, but I don't like Wilson at all. I'm voting Roosevelt again. I'm sorry. I understand William Jennings Bryan endorsed Woodrow Wilson, but I think William Jennings Bryan should have endorsed Roosevelt, actually. Or just divided the political party and run for president again, but oh my god, that would be a crazy four-way race. Oh my god, I can just imagine. William Taft versus Theodore Roosevelt versus William Jennings Bryan versus Woodrow Wilson. That'd be crazy. But yeah, I'm gonna let the results play, and then, we'll move on to the election of 1816. Or 1916. I'm stupid.
office. And here are the results. Woodrow Wilson won, becoming the 28th president in American history. Even though he had less votes than William Jennings Bryan ever had, he still easily won. He received 435 electoral votes and 41.8% of the popular vote. Coming in second was Teddy Roosevelt, who received 88 electoral votes and 27.4% of the popular vote. This was the last presidential election in which a candidate who was not a Republican or Democrat came in second place in either the Electoral College or popular vote. In third place, William Howard Taft, with just 8 electoral votes and 23.2% of the popular vote. With so many former Republicans joining the Progressive Party, this resulted in the Republicans suffering their worst presidential defeat in history. Taft suffered the worst ever defeat of any president trying to get reelected. Interestingly, both Taft and Roosevelt lost their home states. In fourth place, Eugene Debs got 6% of the popular vote. In fifth, Eugene Chafin got 1.4% of the popular vote. Thomas Marshall became the 28th vice president in American history. Wilson would become the only Mr. Beat presents the 33rd presidential election in American history took place on November 7th, 1916. Over in Europe, it pretty much seemed like the end of the world, quite literally. The entire continent was destroying itself. Millions were mobilized and millions were dying in what later became known as World War I. I have a song about World War I, of course. How horrifying was World War I? Well, I strongly recommend the Great War YouTube channel to get the specific details. But to give you a sample, the Battle of Verdun, which was still going on by election day, had been going on since February with no end in sight. Just in this one battle, hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died. This was a new kind of war, one with industrialized weapons that could cause massive destruction, and one that simply the majority of Americans didn't want anything to do with. Still, Americans had good reasons for not being too happy with the Germans. After a British ocean liner carrying Americans called the Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine the previous year, many had called for some kind of action against the Germans. At the same time, the Mexican Revolution was happening to the south, and people didn't know what was going to happen with their government there. It was truly a scary time, but most Americans felt the United States should just stay neutral with foreign affairs. Let's just mind our own business, all right? President Woodrow Wilson had kept the country neutral and ran for re-election with the overwhelming support of the Democratic Party. Wilson and Vice President Thomas Marshall were easily renominated. The Democrats built their entire campaign around the slogan, "He kept us out of war," scaring people into thinking that after suffering their worst presidential defeat in history in 1912, the Republicans tried to rebound and heal the division that had caused the progressives to leave. They went with the moderate and uncontroversial Charles Evans Hughes, who hadn't spoken publicly about political issues in 6 years because he was a Supreme Court justice. Hughes was the only Supreme Court justice to ever be nominated for president by a major political party. The Republicans nominated former Vice President Charles Fairbanks as his running mate, another safe choice. The Progressive Party tried to renominate Theodore Roosevelt, but he turned it down, saying he didn't want to throw the election again to the Democrats. Because Roosevelt now just really wanted to see Wilson out of there, he endorsed Hughes, and many progressives followed his lead. This left the Progressive Party in a bit of a mess, and they simply did not recover from this. Meanwhile, the Socialist Party had to find someone else to run this time, as Eugene Debs was running for Congress instead.
So, with that, I am voting for Charles Evans Hughes. I don't like the way Woodrow Wilson has led our country. I don't like anything about what he's done, and I think that Charles Evans Hughes just wants the United States to be more prepared for World War I, in case we have to fight it, which we all know in the future we do. So yeah, let the results play through, and then we'll go on to the election of 1920. Whew.
Woodrow Wilson won re-election, becoming the first Democrat to win 2 consecutive presidential elections since Andrew Jackson. It was pretty close, though. The electoral vote was one of the closest in American history. Wilson received 277 electoral votes, and Hughes received 254. In fact, this election was not called for several days because everyone was waiting on California to deliver their results. Wilson won California, but only by 3,800 votes. He got a solid 49.2% of the popular vote, though, and Hughes finished with 46.1%. In third place, Alan Benson got 3.2% of the popular. Hughes probably lost the election because he failed to get all of the progressives to come back to the Republican Party. Many still stubbornly refused. Wilson won 200 counties that had never voted Democratic in a two-party contest prior to this election. While things were looking up for the Democrats, they were not looking good for Wilson's promise for keeping the country out of war, as we will see in the next episode.
I'm sorry, guys. I paused thinking I was going to the next video, and I was just going to the election of 1916.
Mr. Beat
So-
presents Presidential Elections in American.
Give me 3 seconds, please.
Mr.
while
Beat
I
presents.
go to the election of 1920. Okay, here we are. Thank you for
By
being
2050,
patient.
there will be more
Let this
plastic
play
than
out.
fish in the oceans. There are 18 billion
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 34th presidential election in American history took place on November 2nd, 1920. Remember how Woodrow Wilson got re-elected because he kept the country out of war? Well, before he was sworn for his second term, it was looking like the United States would be entering World War I. The British had intercepted a telegram sent from Germany to Mexico trying
what
to
had
get
happened
Mexico
was
to
left-
join their side in case the United States entered the war. Not only that, but Germany had begun unrestricted submarine warfare against all ships in the Atlantic Ocean bearing the American flag. Germany did this because Americans were exporting weapons to the Allies, their enemies, of course. But this got more Americans to change their minds about neutrality. More and more Americans now wanted to go to war. Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany in April 1917, and soon American troops were headed to Europe to aid the worn-down French and British troops along the Western Front. Woodrow Wilson wanted this to be the war to end all wars. Sounds good to me. The war ended with an armistice on November 11th, 1918, and Wilson spent the remaining 2 years of his presidency trying to get peace agreements going to prevent something like this from ever happening again. He even had a statement of principles for world peace, which became known as the 14 Points. Wilson worked tirelessly with the Allied
Fun fact, the 14 points are a big part of the reason the United Nations exists.
leaders to help create the League of Nations, an alliance in which all the countries of the world could work together to work out their issues. After the League of Nations was proposed as part of the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson went home to promote it and to try to get the United States to join and sign the treaty. I'll just go ahead and tell you, the United States never signed the Treaty of Versailles and never joined the League of Nations. Congress couldn't get on board, and Wilson was not getting any love at all toward the end of his presidency. Not only that, but Wilson suffered a series of horrible strokes that made him unable to do much during that time. His wife, Edith, pretty much ran things while Woodrow rested. This is why some half joke that she was the first female president of the United States. Anyway, a ton of people wanted to take Wilson's spot to run for president. William Gibbs McAdoo, the former Treasury Secretary and Wilson's son-in-law, was a favorite, but Wilson blocked his nomination, hoping that a deadlocked convention would cause him to get a run a third time, despite the fact that he was physically in terrible health. Instead, the Democrats chose James Cox, the governor of Ohio and founder of a chain of newspapers that today has evolved into Cox Enterprises. They chose Franklin Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, as his running mate. A big part of his appeal was name recognition, as he was a fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, who had died the previous year. The Republicans all of a sudden had a renewed interest in their party thanks to the backlash against the Treaty of Versailles, but they also had a hard time picking a candidate. Their convention was deadlocked between Major General Leonard Wood and Frank Orrin Loudon, the governor of Illinois. Logically, the Republicans picked neither. Instead, in a smoke-filled room at the final hour, they picked Warren Harding, a senator from Ohio. Harding was well-liked in his party because he never really did much to offend anybody. They nominated Calvin Coolidge, the governor of Massachusetts, as Harding's running mate. So essentially, you had two dark horse candidates running against each other. Oh yeah, and third parties. How could I forget?
You know what? I tend to vote blue because I don't like high tariffs. The only red person I voted for since 1884 was Theodore Roosevelt and Charles Evans Hughes, because they didn't speak much of tariffs, and Democratic alternative was not what I liked. But I think I will vote for Warren Harding because I think Cox is too associated with Wilson, and I still don't like Wilson. But yeah, let's let the results play and then go on to the election of 1924.
At them, Eugene Debs. Yep, he's back. But this time, he was in prison. That's right, Debs ran for president despite the fact that he was in prison for trying to get people to resist joining the draft during World War I. Debs talked a lot of trash against the Wilson administration for American involvement in the war, and Wilson called Debs. Here are the results. Warren Harding easily won, becoming the 29th president in American history. It was a landslide. Harding received 404 electoral votes and 60.3% of the popular vote. Cox received just 127 electoral votes and only 34.2% of the popular vote. Eugene Debs, in his fifth and final presidential election, finished third again with 3.4% of the popular vote, and Parley Christensen finished fourth with 1% of the popular vote. Calvin Coolidge became the 29th vice president in American history. Believe it or not, Harding became the first sitting U.S. senator to ever be elected president. How bad did Harding kick Cox's butt? Well, his popular vote victory is the second largest popular vote margin victory in a presidential election, next only to the unopposed election of James Monroe in 1820, in the era of good feelings. Man, this Harding dude must be amazing, right?
We are being deceived. The border crisis is not like what we've been told. Behind the 5 million illegal immigrants who entered our country in the last 2 years are criminal cartels, the United Nations, and the US government. Our investigations uncovered that while Americans are being told that the government is working to resolve the crisis, in reality, coordinated efforts with the
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Election 1924. Calvin Coolidge, the incumbent Republican president, was seeking re-election. Hold up! Calvin Coolidge? Are you for real? What happened to Harding? Harding died in 1923, and so Coolidge took over. At the beginning of Harding's term, there had been a depression, but the economy quickly recovered, and now Coolidge was getting all the credit for it. The Roaring Twenties were now in full swing, when everything seemed to become more modern and urban, and when American culture thrived at home and abroad. Though Hiram Johnson, the senator and former governor of California, challenged him, Calvin Coolidge was the Republican nominee. Charles Dawes of the Dawes Plan fame was his running mate. William Gibbs McAdoo appeared again to be a favorite for the Democratic Party early on. However, he had associated himself with Edward Doheny, a shady character who had become associated with the Teapot Dome scandal, which tainted the Harding administration. As it turns out, Doheny associating with McAdoo really hurt McAdoo, among other things. Al Smith, the governor of New York, also looked to be a favorite. The Democratic National Convention was absolutely crazy. In fact, it was the longest convention ever. There were fistfights between McAdoo and Smith supporters, and the KKK kept coming up. But when it was all said and done, it was John Davis who got the nomination. As a compromise nominee, he didn't even give an acceptance speech because no one was really around to hear it. Davis was fairly obscure. Some remembered him as a former congressman or former U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom or successful lawyer before that. But most people were like, who? Davis was also a surprising choice to some because he was a fairly conservative, limited government type guy. The Democrats nominated Charles Wayland Bryan as his running mate. Bryan was William Jennings Bryan's younger brother. Oh, and the governor of Nebraska. Still, a lot of Americans were unsatisfied with the two-party system. Both Republicans and Democrats were associated with the Teapot Dome scandal, after all, and Coolidge and Davis seemed to be on the same page on a lot of issues. There wasn't much difference. For these Americans, Robert La Follette, the well-known and by this time almost legendary senator from Wisconsin, was the answer. A new political party was created that was centered around La Follette, called the Progressive Party. No, not the Bull Moose Party of 1912, which La Follette actually opposed. This was a new progressive party that united the labor unions and farmers. La Follette, also known as Fighting Bob, fought hard during his entire career for the poor for things like
Alright, so with this in mind, I will vote for Calvin Coolidge because I think he's running the country well. Davis is boring, and La Follette's doing something unnecessary. That's my vote, so I'll let the results play and then go on to 1928. Actually, no, I won't go on to 1928. I will end the video there. Because this video is getting kind of long. Oh, the elections are coming up. Okay, then I'll just let the rest of the video play.
like child labor laws, a social security safety net, and ending Washington cronyism. And that now resonated with many in 1924. Burton Wheeler, a senator from Montana, was La Follette's running mate. As Election Day approached, things were looking really bad for the Democrats, as it appeared that many former Democrats were switching to support La Follette. And here are the results. Calvin Coolidge easily won, remaining the 30th president in American history. He received a dominating 382 electoral votes and 54% of the popular vote. John Davis finished second, receiving 136 electoral votes and only 28.8% of the popular vote. Davis's popular vote percentage is the lowest of any Democratic presidential candidate in American history if you don't count the crazy election of 1860. Robert La Follette finished third, receiving 13 electoral votes, which was just his home state of Wisconsin, and 16.6% of the popular vote. Was La Follette a spoiler? Well, he did mostly draw Democrats to his side, so yeah, you could argue that. However, he used to be a Republican, and it's safe to say he drew at least a few Republicans as well. Charles Dawes became the 30th vice president in American history. And remember, Coolidge and Davis had agreed on many issues. Both wanted limited government, less taxes, and fewer regulations. So La Follette was the only one to offer an opposite.
Alright, I'm going to end the video there. Thank you all for watching, and please subscribe, like, comment, and I will see you all.